Good afternoon. Welcome everybody to this event this afternoon in... Can we... Oh, that's better. Okay. It's a little bit loud. Can you put it a little bit down? Again, a very warm welcome and good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to today's event on a topic actually that we haven't really done very much here at Bruegel, but we are very, very happy to engage on the topic of migration that is related to climate change. And we are organizing this event on the occasion of a very interesting report that was actually written by Delmi, which is a Swedish migration studies delegation. And we are very happy that you joined us today. You brought copies of the report and you're here also in the panel. So what we will do this afternoon is we will have a small presentation of the main findings of this report. And Rainer Munz, who is a migration expert and an author of this report, will present the results. And then we will engage in a conversation with the panelists and very briefly introduce them, if I may. On my left, I have Joachim Palmer, who is the committee chair of the studies delegation in Sweden. On my right, I have Martin Taschner, who is the head of the Migration Management Preparedness Unit at the European Commission. And we also have online, she will join us in a minute, Jane Lineker, who is the 4MI Global Coordinator of the Mixed Migration Center. So we will spend 15 minutes, Rainer, on the report. Then we'll have half an hour of conversation with the panelists. And after that, we would like to open the floor for questions. We will also be taking questions from the audience that is with us online. So with that, Rainer, the floor is yours give us the main results of the report.
Welcome everybody. Mic on?
Yeah.
I'm very... Too much sound?
Yeah, all good.
Yeah. I'm very happy to be here after 2 years and 9 months for the last time here. Only my second trip to Brussels in 3 years. Yeah. So it's like homecoming, I can tell you.
A little bit, yeah.
I will present a study that has been triggered by my friend Joachim Palmer and financed by Delmi. And Joachim, you may say 3 more words about Delmi afterwards, but it's a Swedish government agency which funds, among other things, migration research in an independent way. So it's not a direct government, how you say, ordre de mufti, as we would say here. So Joachim approached me when I retired from the commission whether I would want to think about migration and climate change. And foolishly, I said yes, because I had no clue how little I would know about it and understand about it. So I'm going to present main findings that we have found out. So it's about climate change and the mobility it induces. And so there's 3 ways in which external events of that kind influence mobility. The one is natural disasters, sudden impact. This leads more often to displacement than to permanent relocation. Gradual changes of the livelihoods, like droughts, freshwater stress, things like that. Sea level rise that lead more often to permanent change of residents. And then a degradation of the subsistence base, so that via an economic, negative economic impact, you sometimes have to move. Which is often not perceived as climate change, but as economic effect by people. So I start with the natural disasters. What you see here is a graph showing natural disasters over the past 120 years. And you instantly see that there is a big increase between the 1960s and the early 2000s, and then something like not so much of a change over the past 20 years. When I started studying, I thought natural disaster is something that is defined by natural science, but it's not. A natural disaster is defined by an extreme weather and climate event that has an impact on people. And so if you have more people living in an area, it's more likely that the extreme event is defined as a natural disaster. So heavy rain over Antarctica doesn't affect anybody, and if it would happen, it would not be counted. So there's not just a natural science definition behind it. And this is why this increase has to do with the expansion of settlement areas. The increase has also to do with more people getting insurance, because insurance companies are an important source of information about that kind of extreme events. And the main good news today for you to take away is that despite the natural disasters having increased a lot, the likelihood that you die from it has declined by 95% over the past 100 years in absolute numbers. So we no longer die as a result from natural disasters, despite the fact that we have 4 times more people living on our planet than 100 years ago, and that we have many more, at least registered, natural disasters. So disasters are leading to displacement, and when you distinguish between geophysical disasters, which is volcano eruptions, earthquakes, and tsunamis, and those related to weather and climate, you see that most natural disasters, or most people displaced by natural disasters, are victims of weather-related extreme conditions. So that's the blue one is geophysical, and the orange one is weather-related. But also 342 million people have been displaced over the past 14 years, so lost their homes as a result of a natural disaster. 90% of them because of weather and climate-related natural disasters. But there's no clear trend over the past 14, 15 years that you could see. So that's a big number. And you see half of them is floods, about a bit more than 30 storms, and then you have about 11% which is related to geophysical events. So floods and storms. These are the main events that drive people from their homes, sudden impact events. Very rarely does such a disaster spill into other countries by displacing people across international borders. It's a rare event. I went through the records of DG ECHO, which is publishing maps, several maps a day or a week, and I found 5 examples. One, and they can be explained. One is a protracted drought in Somalia, and because the drought happened in an area that was controlled and still is controlled by the Al-Shabaab militias, it was almost impossible for international aid and relief workers to get to the area to bring water and food to the people. And this is why people had to go to another country where the distribution of aid was safer. So that can easily be explained. Or the other explanation is a flood along the Sava and Drina rivers in 2014. And because the Sava and Drina River is a international border between Croatia, Bosnia, and Serbia, you saw people going to the other side, in particular because there's, co-ethnics of the different ethnic groups living on the other side. So what happens to people displaced by natural disasters? That's maybe the second good news. There's many, way too many, but out of the 342 million people displaced by natural disasters, at the end of last year, only 6 million people had not returned to their homes or to the region from which they have been displaced. So this is a return rate of 98%. When you look at people displaced after political violence and civil wars or interstate wars, you could only dream of a return rate of 98%. They have protracted displacement over years, likelihood of return way below 50% nowadays. And then you can explain this 6 million. It happens in failed states like Afghanistan or South Sudan, or it happens in places like the Philippines or Bangladesh, where the island on which you have been living has been literally washed away and no longer exists, so there is no original place to return to. So now comes the difficult part, and this is assessing what the gradual change of habitat would have as an impact, because there, it's unlike disasters, it's not reported to the same extent. But we know what is the triggers. It's rising sea levels. It's degradation of soils, reducing crop yields and agricultural productivity. It's extreme droughts and freshwater stress, and is something that is, more interesting. There's more interest in Scandinavia or in Russia on it. It's a thawing of permafrost soil, which makes it very difficult if you have been settling there to sustain the place where your building has been built on ice and the ice is melting, or roads and infrastructure. Now, we know which parts of the world will be exposed more in the future, already today. So in the case of Europe, it's basically the Mediterranean and the Black Sea region, which will become hotter and drier. But there's plenty other parts of the world where this dryness will become more common, populated and not so populated ones. Sorry, now it's too much. The second group of people affected is by extreme winds, hurricanes, typhoons, which is basically, we always speak about the Caribbean and the southeastern part of the US, but it's also happening in the Indian Ocean, a little bit around Madagascar and Réunion, and it's happening in the East China, South China Sea, and in the sea between northeast of Australia and Papua New Guinea. Then we have river deltas, heavily populated, but also important for agricultural production, where you have a combination of downstream floods from rain and upstream floods that come from high tides, gustly winds in that combination. And then we have this permafrost area that you find more in the publication about it. Now, why do we know that has an impact? We know that it has an impact because when you look back for the last 30 years, the number of people living on the countryside globally has increased by 300 million people, whereas the number of people living in cities has increased by 2.4 billion people, despite the fact that people have many more children on the countryside than in the city. And so most urban growth can be explained by rural to urban migration. There's a weak signal, and you see many more people now live in cities. And if you go to a city, this reduces your risk of being exposed to droughts or freshwater stress, but increases your risk of becoming victim of a flood. And it also increases exposure risk to heat waves, because the temperature in cities is usually 2, 3, 4 degrees higher than in the surrounding areas. So you're switching, you're not escaping the effects of climate change by going to a city usually, but you are switching a slow onset exposure to a sudden onset risk. There's many predictions how many climate migrants there might be in the future, but there's what I found in the literature is a high uncertainty about the future. So when you look at the IPCC climate scenarios, it makes a huge difference when it comes to drought exposure or to extreme heat waves, where the temperature rise is going to be 1.5 or 3%. A huge difference. Yeah. Same for sea level rise. We have everything in the cards between 0.5 meter and 1.5 meters in the different scenarios. And for each scenario, you still have a large variation how many people might be affected by it. And then you have to find out how many of the affected people will change their place of residence. Why am I saying that? So 327 million people are living below 5 meters above sea level. And some of them already below sea level. Think of the Netherlands, 30%. In the high-income countries, out of the 62 million people living below 5 meters above sea level, 3% have been washed away from their homes over the past 14 years. Whereas when you go to poorer countries, you see it's getting more likely. Out of the 27 million people living below 5 meters above sea level in poor countries, 2/3 have been literally had to leave their homes at least once over the past 14 years. So it's not just where you live vis-à-vis the sea level, but it's also which country, whether there's provisions, whether there's preparedness. And I think that's very important. Yeah, if you live in a high-income country, living near the sea is not so much of a risk. In a poor country, it is. So climate change does not automatically lead to loss of livelihoods and displacement. This depends upon the circumstances. Now, what can we do? One thing is, and Martin has a longer experience with that, is humanitarian intervention and disaster relief. You immediately react. So that's a matter of how much capacity you have, and it's a matter how good your weather forecasts are. You can usually not predict earthquakes, but can very well predict tsunami. We can predict hurricane, for example. How much capacity you have and how quickly you can deploy it, and whether you can evacuate people up front, which usually saves lots of lives. Then, obviously, prevention, emitting less greenhouse gas in various ways, which would include a different type of agriculture as well, which is often overlooked. Agriculture responsible for at least 14% of global greenhouse gas emissions. So in the European context, that's about the Green Deal. Yeah? Permanent resettlement. So this picture is from Malé, the capital of the Maldives. Probably the Maldives might disappear altogether, then you would have to have permanent resettlement. Even this is not fully clear when you look at the activities of the Chinese in the South China Sea, where they are doubling, tripling the height of coral reefs and then build airports on it. You see maybe even low-lying islands could have a future with a lot of preventive investment here. Tuvalu, highest point over sea level, 3 meters in the whole country. Insurance companies kicking in this part of Miami Beach, you're no longer getting insurance disaster insurance for your house. So that's also a capital market incentive here to move. Here is a map, you find this in the publication, of already ongoing permanent resettlement cases where certain places are transferred. The biggest of that resettlement is going to happen in Indonesia, where the government has decided to move the capital, Jakarta, or at least the main institutions, to a place in Kalimantan called Nuantara, which will be built. So a Brasilia in the jungle. Changing the subsistence base. So if people are subsistence farmers and there's not enough water, they might earn an income from other activities and then buy food instead of having to grow or elevate animals themselves. Adaptation and mitigation, so building dams, this is a no-brainer. The Netherlands are a good example that can work well. The other example is Venice, which after 30 years have managed to also build that kind of band. Last intervention is insurance and capital markets that are underestimated in their positive effect they could have in mitigating the effects of climate change. So cat bonds, for those who are familiar with that, is one of the key words that how you spread risk and help insurance and particularly reinsurance companies to bear that burden. Crop insurance can help leveling out changes in income of farmers, for example. Elementary insurance would help a lot if everybody would have to have an elementary insurance. Like if you drive a car, you have to be insured. If you build a house near a river, you do not need to be insured. And I think that's something we need to think of. There's other reasons why it's not working. So, final slide. The point is a mix of exposure to risks and the resilience of the country and of the society in that area, which is a mixed picture of both here on this Verisk Maplecroft map that gives you an idea what the danger is for people who are there. You need both sides before you come to the conclusion that people will lose their homes or will have to leave or whatever. And even if you're negatively exposed, it's not sure whether you will still manage to go to another country. So that's it in short. get the full story from our report can easily be downloaded. And then I hand over to Maria. Thanks a lot.
Thank you very much, Rainer. That's absolutely lovely. So thank you for actually a lot of interesting results, and thank you to the report for commissioning this. For the moment, let me just then summarize. If I understand your presentation correctly, there are two different things that we need to think about. One is the natural disaster type of migration, and then there is the migration that will happen much more slowly due to climate change, and they feed themselves very differently and reverse very differently, right? Okay, then I see there are already questions coming in, but maybe Joachim, maybe if I turn to you, because you are part of the institution that commissioned this report, would you like to perhaps give your take immediately before I turn to my guests about the results of this analysis?
Yeah, I mean, the background to this report is a sort of ongoing discussion between migration and climate research, and I think among climate researchers there's been a strong expectation that what we see in terms of international migration is driven by climate change, and that this will get worse. So an argument for sort of enhancing sort of climate policies, but in my sort of discussion with climate research, I found it difficult to convince them, and so this is the background why we commissioned this report to be written. And I think the important takeaway is that we don't have international climate migration of any major size. This does not make things look better. Quite the contrary, we know that there are projections, and if climate or temperatures are going up, we know that the small spillovers that we see are likely to be bigger. But also that we have this massive displacement of people in the poorest countries. So this is, I think, both a moral challenge for us in this part of the world, that have, a responsibility to act, given the fact that we have contributed to so much to the increased temperature so far, and also to think in terms of policies in different ways. And I think this is also why I think the report is good. It outlines different ways of dealing with this, not only in terms of pushing for more reductions in greenhouse gas emissions, but also for facilitating the adaptation. And I think that there's a set of policies that we need to discuss further. And so I'm happy to engage with you in that.
Great, thank you very much. And in fact, there is already I think the most obvious question is coming also, and in here questions coming from people online. And Jane, is Jane online? If I may turn to Jane for the first question, and that is that the numbers that we've seen as telling us a story that we don't have cross-border migration due to climate. We do have displacement, but it's all within. Most of it is within borders. It's very actually interesting in the sense, because instead of understanding that the narrative that we have when it comes to climate migration is actually quite different, isn't it, Jane? Would you like to comment on that?
Yeah, thanks. And sorry, I can't be there in person. But yeah, I think this is it's a really key thing to bear in mind, particularly in Europe. I mean, we're talking about fleeing the flood, but where are people fleeing to? And a lot of the narratives are about expectations of a flood of migrants crossing regions and arriving in more high-income countries. I think we take issue, and the findings of the report bear this out, that the narrative that predominates, it's not accurate. And in fact, it's not very helpful in looking for solutions and finding policies that will help to respond to the kinds of movements that we're going to see in terms of climate mobility. So we need to be really careful about how numbers are being used and the methods that we're using to trigger action on climate change, because sometimes it's done with very good intentions to call people to action. But maybe we need to think about that a little bit more. At the Mixed Migration Centre, we've been engaging a lot more in the topic of climate mobility, taking this mixed migration lens. And we've also found, you know, the majority of people we speak to who are affected by climate-related events, they're not thinking about moving, or they don't want to move. Those who do move are mainly, going to move very locally, and it is going to be more of a challenge for urbanisation, and particularly urbanisation of secondary cities. So not the big capitals, just urbanisation of secondary cities, which may not have the resources or the infrastructure to cope with this urbanisation. So very few are considering cross-border migration, even fewer are engaging in it. Borderland areas, which was referred to just now, are a bit more, there is a bit more movement because there's traditionally always been more movement in borderland areas. But yeah, it's very much an amplifier of existing migration dynamics, just like climate change impacts are a kind of stress multiplier. They're an indirect driver of migration. I think one of the things that I think is important is that if this indirect nature, it's primarily relating to livelihoods, but also to people's health, to people's security. So people may have a poor harvest, their fishing boat may be destroyed, and this might trigger movement. And this difference between displacement from a sudden onset event and then people returning home. The problem that we might find, and I think we're already observing in some places, is that repeated displacement, knowing that you're going to go back home only to find that next year you'll be displaced again, might lead to, and is leading to, a different form of movement. So we're looking at all different kinds of mobility, also involuntary immobility, people being stuck, people being part of their household is moving, the whole household is moving. So we're looking at issues of space, issues of time, and it's not, you know, there's one narrative of climate mobility. There's many forms, and it's really important to adapt and think about those different kinds. I think I'll leave it there, but yeah, there's a lot more to say about how this global problem needs to be looked at very locally, and about the specific profiles and places, women's impacts on women and how they make decisions, different places, different people, and what kinds of climate mobility we can expect in those different places and with those different people. Thanks.
Thanks very much, Jane. And we'll come to sort of how to think about what to do about it, either at the local level or at the global coordinated level. But Martin, if you allow me, I wanted to ask one question to Rainer before we come to you, because Rainer, there is this, you are a migration expert. You've done a lot of work, which here you presented also Bruegel in other occasions. And we tend to bundle everything together. So the climate migration and displacement with kind of refugee migration coming from areas that are in conflict. Could you give us a sense of how these two may be different, also in view of the results you presented in this report? How can we think about the two types of migration, of displacement, but in different ways?
So most of migration, particularly international migration, has to do with neither. It's neither climate nor conflict. So, I mean, when you look at the Brussels bubble, you see in Brussels 60% of the Brussels population is born outside Belgium, I mean, including many people sitting here in the room. So we are going for opportunity, for economic gains, things like that. That's a normal way. Also in Africa, there's freedom of movement within Western Africa, the ECOWAS community, plenty of people moving from one country to another. And very difficult to identify how much of this is triggered by climate or conflict, but might be. Huh? When you live in northern Kenya and there's Boko Haram around and you move to neighboring Ghana, that can be triggered by violence at home. It's not easy to disentangle. But you can say the number of international migrants compared to world population is extremely small. Only 3.4% of world population not living in the country where they are born. So most people never migrate to another country during their whole lifetime. So it's a rare event from a statistical point of view. And most of this migration is neither related to violence nor to climate. I think that's the baseline you can say. Whereas where it plays a role is domestic mobility, which has initially nothing to do with international migration. As I said, the number of people living in cities has increased by 2.4 billion people over the past 30 years, despite the fact that we have usually more people dying in cities than being born. So it's basically rural to urban or small city to bigger city migration, mobility within a country, not international migration. But here comes the but. People who move from a countryside to the city learn that you can make more money there, that you can survive mobility, leaving your home, will probably be more likely to move to another country to a certain degree. So it prepares you, yeah, because without cash income, you can usually not move to another country. Yeah, you need first access to cash. And this is how it translates. Now, we have predictions like 25 million climate refugees, 50 million, no, it's 100, 200 million, 500 million. All these data underlying these predictions are coming from climate scientists who are not migration experts. So the interesting thing, what I found in the literature, that coming up with these big numbers and threats and horrible and I don't know, we need to close our borders or prepare for that and build shelters or whatever, is all coming from the climate side and then taken up by political scientists, social scientists, migration researchers who are not doing the research themselves. They're glad that this is already provided on a silver plate, a number, and then they draw their conclusions from it. Because it's cumbersome for migration and particularly political scientists to go into the mathematical models of the climate researchers and seeing whether what's the substance behind the model that produces these 500 million. Yeah, and this is completely refined. You have satellite images. We know how many people are living on which part of the world, almost on a daily basis, because the satellite images are coming frequently, and so it's very. I mean, it's very solid to see so many people are exposed to that risk. But the conclusion that because 350,000 people in that area are exposed to that risk, all of them will move out, this is something that is beyond the competence of climate research. This is where you would need a migration researcher. But usually the two sides are not talking to each other. They're just picking, the ones are picking the results from the other. And there's another complication by the fact that when you do surveys, many people affected by climate change have never heard of climate change. So a friend of mine was doing a survey in eastern Ghana, southeastern Ghana, where you have clearly coastal erosion because of rising sea levels. She has interviewed, intensive interviews with 35 people. None of them has mentioned climate as a reason for mobility. They were all making economic arguments. And then you get into an interesting predicament. You, the white European male or female researcher, is saying, I know better. You're not moving for the reasons you're mentioning, you're moving for other reasons that I know better. Interesting colonial approach to social science. Or you say, oh, I accept your answer, it has nothing to do with climate change, then you get the applause from people denying climate change and saying it's not happening. And see, it's proof that climate change plays no role, something like that. It's an interesting being caught in the middle that I found. I mean, I would have never anticipated that kind of conflict. So that's my answer.
So if I might turn to you then, Martin, if you can help us think about, so we know the predictions of climate, of the science of climate and how climate will change, but it's not so easy to understand the predictions of the forecast of migration, how much, I mean, we've seen so far, interesting number that Rainer mentioned, the 98% return rate, but this is on the natural disaster part of the story. Can you help us think about how to think about the forecast, how to think about the future before what to do about it?
Thanks a lot. Can you hear me? Yes.
Yes.
First of all, thanks a lot for this very interesting and timely report. And thanks, Rainer, also for the very interesting presentation, which you underpinned with a lot of figures, which I found extremely useful in order to have an approach to see how can we measure the problem. When we look now into how to anticipate for the future, because this we have to do, we have to think in timelines. There is the sudden onset disasters, and there are already a number of these very short-sighted tools in place where the DG ECHO, you mentioned already, the Emergency Response Coordination Center, has indeed some early warning instruments in place for tsunamis, earthquakes and for hurricanes, of course, as you mentioned. It's very short-sighted, but it allows still to buy sometimes some hours or a day in order to be able to respond to a natural sudden onset disaster. And in that vein, and for all the levels, preparedness is absolutely key. You need to know what you do when the disaster hits. And I think there's a lot to do to work on disaster preparedness, on plans. We said in the commission when I worked in DG ECHO, well, that's not the sexy part of it. The interesting part is the response part, where you can be in the limelight, where you can see of it. But the reality of things is that the costs are 5 times higher on the response side than on the preparedness side. So to be able to prepare for a natural disaster is, in that situation, absolutely key. When we move now to the next step, which would mean how do you forecast, it is absolutely key to have data collection and to have your data ready. What is the size of your problem, and what, for which kind of scenarios you need to prepare. And I think their scenario building is absolutely key, and I cannot agree more. You really have to bring the two communities together to understand on the one side what is happening on the climate change, and how then there will be climate change induced migration triggered by that. And I think there needs a lot more to be done in this. Therefore, I very much welcome with the studies, because there are still many open questions, including for the time being, I have it also here in my script, there is no displacement over the border, but that can be just a question of months, of years, and one day it will be there. And this kind of forecasting, to be able to see how the situation will be developed, is very important. And that data is an absolutely key element on which I think all the organizations, institutions need to work together in that respect. And then one step further, this is what we're doing today, is basically foresight. I have here a figure, World Bank, I don't think it was mentioned yet, that 2050, 216 million could be displaced because of slow onset climate change impacts. So this kind of foresight discussions is already taking place, and it's very important also. We have a lot of unclarity yet, but we all know that it's going to happen. So the question is, how are we able to bring all the analyses and the data together to have the good models in place to move to the next step, which would be indeed to have the forecasting in place. And I think this kind of anticipatory action, investment also in anticipation is absolutely key. I very much, Rainer, enjoyed also the example which you gave on the floods on the Western Balkans, in Bosnia and in Serbia, because I was dealing at that time in DG ECHO with the response side. It was very interesting to see that on the preparedness side there was very little done. So clearly the need to invest more on that. There were no plans on how to respond. Although one could say, well, floods in that part of Europe are very common. They happen very often, but there were no concrete plans at that time. We talk about 2014 in place. So clearly, lessons learned. Let's have a plan already for that situation, because we know that it will happen. What was interesting to see that on the response side, we were, I think, pretty good. There were civil protection mechanism. Member states, basically almost all member states, sent their support in there, and it went very well before the humanitarian assistance kicked in. And then, and this is, I think, the role of the humanitarian development nexus also, to be able to come in then with development assistance. The Commission, I can just cite 2-3 initiatives, but certainly there are more in the pipeline also. July 2022, there's a staff working document in order to address displacement and migration related to disasters, climate change, and environmental degradation. I already gave you some insight basically in terms of actions which are needed. One I should mention and add is multilateral engagement. I think that's very important. This is clearly a question for multilateralism, where it doesn't make any sense that everybody moves around, every country tries to solve it on its own. It will not work. So this is clearly a subject to bring to that level also. But also the Pact on Migration and Asylum, which was proposed by the Commission in September 2020, also clearly identifies climate change as one of the future drivers for migration as well. So this is also, I would say, an area which underpins and why the adoption of this pact is so important also, because this is one of the action which would allow the EU member states to work closer together. And the third initiative is we have this so-called European Migration Network, where we work together with member states, but also observer countries. Ukraine is there, Montenegro is there. Some of the Western Balkan countries are also have also joined or about to join. And there we want to see the practice of the member states. How do they prepare and bring together with the OECD in order to see what kind of actions in terms of preparedness, mitigation measures, and cooperation are already in place in order to inform this debate, which is absolutely needed and for which we are already today part of it. Thank you, Maria.
Thank you very much, Martin. So you've already moved into the space of what to do about it, and thank you for describing some of the initiatives that we have here in the EU and how to deal with these types of issues within the EU. So I want to turn both to Joachim and to perhaps start with you, Jane, on how would you go about thinking the response? How do you prepare the policy response? How do you prepare to think about it and actually mitigate the effects of on migration?
Thanks. Yeah, I think, data, forecasting, knowledge, they're all really important. I'm a researcher. I understand the importance of filling all these information gaps and wanting to respond based on the evidence we have. The team that we work with, we recently worked on the Africa Climate Mobility Initiative, and we worked with the team doing modeling that also worked on the World Bank's ground soar report. And that's part of the story, and it's really important to understand these models and these large numbers. It's also really important to understand what's going on the ground with people. Like was just said, a lot of people are not even, climate literacy levels can be very, very low in some places, but people still know what is happening to them and they know how to adapt to their environment where they live. What happens is that people can get exhausted. Their resources are exhausted and they're unable to adapt. There is the humanitarian disaster response, preparedness, risk reduction, which is a really key element and very important to save lives and reach the most vulnerable. But what I think is still very important for us to work a lot more on is the adaptation. So understanding how different communities, how different population groups can adapt to what we know is going to happen in their environments. And this can be very different, and we need to work with local communities. When we look at stuff like planned relocation, we did data collection in Mozambique with some people who had been resettled just beyond where they were living. And for some it was successful, some it wasn't. But these processes have to be done with the local community, and we do need to fill those knowledge gaps and learn from them on what they need and how they can adapt best. So I think something is giving people the choice and making their livelihood sustainable, whether they stay or whether they go. And I think a lot of attention has to be paid in that direction in terms of adaptable financing for adaptation within those communities, filling information gaps, working locally on local solutions. And I think it's important to get that small targeted focus as well as understanding the big numbers and some of the larger issues that need to be faced.
Great, thank you. Sorry, Joachim, you want to say so? Yeah. Of course.
I think, of course, everything has to be local in the end, but I would like to underline the importance of regional cooperation. We saw from Rainer's maps here that there's a concentration of different kinds of disasters in different regions of the world, and I think we can see also regional cooperation in Latin America when it comes to dealing with the victims of natural disasters and to take care of citizens of other countries once something dramatic happens. I think we can see in other regions as well. India has a program for helping people to resettle, especially in island communities. Europe is also doing a lot when it comes to dealing with the consequences of would be one way of sort of making it possible to then in the end act at local level.
In fact, I want to take this comment because there's a question that comes from the audience on this. But before I do that, I just want to check whether there are people here in the audience that would like to ask a question to our panelists. Okay, there's many questions. Let's take two, and then I will come back to one of the gentleman there in the second row.
the Market Center. Question to maybe a volunteer from the panel. Indeed, climate change induced migration is really not happening as Rainer presented in terms of people crossing the international borders. But we have this potential scenario which I think nobody can completely exclude of at some point in the future, a lot of Africans under extreme scenarios somehow wanting to migrate to the European Union. This kind of a dystopian fantasy. What do you think about using this argument in our debates about countering the climate change?
Thank you. One more question here. We just collect a few, and then we have a second round. Yeah. Great, thank you very much. And with that, I also wanted to take the question that comes from A. Bowery here in the online audience, and it goes beyond a little bit the argument that you make, Joachim, about the regional cooperation. Actually, here the defining line is between high-income countries and low-income countries. I think the last map you had was actually quite shocking in showing not just the concentration of natural disasters, but the ability to deal with them. And in fact, the big difference between the Netherlands and other parts of the world is that the Netherlands has invested and continues to invest millions every year to deal with the slow rising seas, and therefore that's why it was green in your, which means that the societal investment that comes in is enormous and will continue to be enormous, even in this part of this world. But that of course makes the defining line between high-income countries and low-income countries extremely prominent. So you know, how do we think about not only regional cooperation but between regions cooperation? Who would like to go first? I don't know. Yeah, we will have a second round. So. Would you like to go first, Martin? Yeah.
Maybe I can. Sorry.
Yeah, it's
Hello?
okay.
Maybe I can do with the first question. I think we should put it wider and not just see it from the European perspective versus what could happen in Africa. I think it's a global phenomenon, and it could happen in many parts of the world. Of course, certainly from a European perspective, we might be more affected by climate-induced migration from Africa, certainly. But I think it does not really help to say this is, I would say, a local phenomenon. The EU could be affected by many parts of the world also. And I think the fact already, and then this is indeed the climate change debate also, to say that there will be movements, and putting people at risk through climate change already should be, for me, an argument strong enough also, which will impact basically many regions in the world in a very strong way. And I would really put the argument that forward. Otherwise, we might be indeed counter-argue to say you have again this Eurocentric approach, you're again looking at it only from your own perspective, while it is a global phenomenon. I think this would be my short answer to that. But of course, in our internal scenario building, which I mentioned, of course, certainly this look to how this could have an impact on Northern Africa and beyond also, and very much also beyond, I think is of course a very important one. On the demography, yes, absolutely. I think we should absolutely keep this in mind as well. It could certainly reinforce some of the future movements also, and especially in regions which have a high demography. And it's very interesting, the regions which Rainer has shown also, and certainly demographic developments might even amplify some of the developments, including also displacements. On the third question, maybe I think there's Joachim maybe better placed.
In fact, there's more questions coming in about the need for sort of a multilateralism and multilateral solution to handling the global flow of migrants. Joachim, I don't know, would you like to address?
Yeah, of course, these are global issues, fundamentally. So I'm all for increased importance of multilateralism. But I still think that a number of successful regional initiatives. I think that's also something to build on. And then I see here in the flow of questions that development aid can of course be directed to prevent the most disastrous effect of sort of soil degeneration, etc. But then maybe we need to think beyond the kinds of instruments that Rainer talked about in terms of insurance, because so much of the farming is on family farming and on sort of subsistence farming, and there the access to cash and credits is problematic in the first place, and with the kinds of initiatives that we have seen with microcredits and so on, I think they need to be topped up with insurance mechanism. And here I think that the rich world can play a very important role in terms of handling these risks that are very local and can't be sort of dealt with the microcredit system.
Jane, did you have any response to the questions asked?
Yeah, just briefly, I think what's important to understand is that so many people still will not be moving. We are going to potentially face trapped populations, and people do not want to move and do not want to move very far. So I think we really need to remember that. Yes, there will be an amplification of cross-border migration to a degree. But I think most people would be happy to be able to adapt and stay in place. That's what we found from the research that we've done. And we recently conducted a mapping into activities that are occurring in terms of response, in terms of climate adaptation response. And one of the things we found is that access to financing is very difficult, and particularly women who are more likely to be involved in agriculture. If they can't own property and they don't have any access to land tenure and they can't make decisions about their household, getting them to have access to funding and to do the adaptation that they need to do to be able to continue with their livelihoods is very difficult. So I think that something that's important is this adaptation and access to funding. Yeah.
Indeed, thank you for bringing that dimension. Rainer?
Demography. There's no direct link between climate change and demography. Yeah? Indirect, yes, because the growth of urban population is linked to rural population growth. Yeah, it's not happening in the cities. So the population growth is taking elsewhere. Yeah, and then it has repercussions for the bigger cities. And as cities are along rivers and seashores, most of them, people are switching from that slow onset exposure to a sudden impact risk. That's what you can see. There is 1.3 billion people living in Africa. It's about a little less than 500,000 coming to Europe every year. Of them, about 50, 60, 70,000 in an irregular manner. Yeah. So what do you learn?
The rest is regular.
The rest is regular migration from Africa to Europe. Most of it is marriage migration. It's called family reunion. But as we are not recruiting labor from African countries, it can only be getting married into diasporas that are already established here. It's a weak link. And it's not coming from the demographically fastest growing countries. So there is absolutely a negative correlation between population growth and migration. The faster population is growing, the fewer people are moving because they're poor. Yeah. Now, with our help, we build roads from the inland to the sea, we build railways, we give people access to cash income by developing the economy. So basically what it does is that the development increases the number of people who have a choice to choose whether they want to stay or go. So development will ultimately lead to more migration, and including more migration to Europe. This is why it's so dangerous to link all these efforts to the indicator of arrivals in Europe, because it's not a sustainable argument to say we have to invest in Africa, and if the motive is only because we want to prevent people from coming, then you can only fail. And then public and political support for investment in Africa will fade away rather quickly because politicians have this short-term circle. Yeah, they're not interested in something that's going to materialize in 50 years from now. So I think one has to disentangle that. India and China are the most populous parts of the world. And they are countries in absolute numbers, largest numbers of their citizens living abroad. But in absolute terms, emigration plays absolutely no role for the demographic development in India and China. They're so large, it's, I don't know, 1% of the population or 2% that are living outside. So it's insignificant in order to understand how many people are left in India. And so I think the absolute numbers play a role on our side. Whereas in order to understand what's the dynamic, we need to look at the relative size of the outflow in the place of origin.
Yeah.
And so that's a comparison we need to make before we come to a conclusion. Will there be immigration from Africa to Europe in the future? Yes. In the past, most of it have been regular and legal. Do we want more marriage migration from Africa to Europe? That's a completely other question, which has nothing to do with legal consideration. This is about can these people quickly integrate, to come with the right skills, something like that. There you can put a question mark if you want. Yeah? But that's not directly linked to demography. If you would bring down population growth in certain areas, then you will see more emigration from these parts of Africa, most likely. Only for another 50 or 100 years, and then sometime in the 22nd century, we'll have a different picture. But emigration from Europe started in the Industrial Revolution and lasted till the 1950s. Yeah, we have been a continent of emigration for most of the last 200 years. It's only since 1985 that more people are moving from other parts of the world to Europe than moving out. So yeah. for us, it's a so why would you expect in Africa that by investing 40 billion, emigration will immediately stop? That's completely naive and has absolutely no foundation in economic history in other parts that we can draw from other parts of the world. So that's a short answer.
An important fact that I've heard you use this before, but I think remember that Europe has always been sending people away than receiving them. It's very recent that we're in net terms receiving. And we have time for one more question. I think there was a question there, the lady at the back, and then two very quick questions and your final thoughts. The lady at the back first. Yes, thank you.
Hello, my name is Maria Diallo, and I'm a trainee at DG INPA for the European Commission, working on migration and forced displacement. So as development cooperation was mentioned, I had a question on the triple nexus on humanitarian, development, and peace processes. So for those who don't know, it's an approach that aims to gather the synergy between development assistance, development action, and humanitarian assistance, and peace processes. So my question is more maybe to DG Home. Would that approach be included in the preparedness action? Thank you.
Thank you very much. And the gentleman in front of her? Thank you.
Yes, good afternoon. I work for the Belgian Trade Union Confederation. In the to-do list of measures to be taken, preventive or resilience measures, several speakers mentioned, from one hand, the role of private insurance and private insurance company, and also the role of civil protection. What about social protection? And I ask the question, of course, because, as you said, climate change destroy economic infrastructure and livelihood, and has a negative impact on income and livelihood.
Thank you very much. So why don't I come back to my speakers, and then with please attempt any questions the way you see fit, and maybe one last final thought or a key message that you would like us to take away. Jane, I look at you to start first.
Okay, thanks. I think it's important to acknowledge the cross-cutting nature of climate change impacts. It's not just a migration issue. Climate mobility is not just a migration issue. It's not just for climate change people, and it's similar to the humanitarian development. You know, climate mobility will be a humanitarian issue for disaster response. It's also a development issue for sustainable development in the future and adaptation and resilience. So yes, these things need to be brought together. There's also, you know, the inarguable, in some places identified and sometimes not, the connection between conflict and climate change. So yes, these things need to be working together, and it will be good to hear more about that from those more involved. And I wanted to, just to emphasize this I was at COP27 and I saw the climate people talking to the climate people, and the mobility people aren't necessarily very present there, and it's starting, and it's really important that these two are brought together to understand each other as much in the data and the research, but also in programming, policy, implementation. Thanks.
A question on this, so thank you very much. Joachim?
Well, thank you. I think these issues don't allow themselves to be simplified. These are very complex issues. And we need to deal with them in a sort of coordinated and complex fashion if you want to be successful. And I think this goes for both, I mean, reducing greenhouse gas emissions, not only to have carbon taxes and think you can fix it. You need to have a integrated approach, protecting people, also this part of the world. And I think that we need to develop also complex strategies to deal with the adaptation problems in poorer parts of the world. But I think you had a picture of the Green Deal and the enormous investments that we are now doing in Europe in order to get out of another crisis, the corona crisis. And I think this shows that we need to think the unthinkable. It's possible to act here and reverse some of the if not all of the negative trends, and we should not let that slip out of our hands.
Complexity must not be underestimated. Martin?
Thank you. We are, I would say, in a difficult situation because we are faced with a lot of short-sighted crises which take basically almost all of our attention. Look into Ukraine, which became I would say, the crisis for which I would say also the European Commission has, of course, need and has to put a lot of focus, while we need at the same time to do the foresight, looking into the longer term evolving possible crises of the future, in which we also have to invest. Where we also have to invest to be able to anticipate, to prepare, and to respond if needed. And colleague from INPA was saying, of course, absolutely, we have already in place coordinated programming which is in place between humanitarian and development in line with the Humanitarian Development Peace Nexus, and these are exactly the instruments which you need in order to fund disaster risk reduction, which you can do on the humanitarian side, but also on the longer term cycles under risk development funding, which you should even do. And there, already over the past years for the European Commission, looking also into the climate change impact on livelihoods plays an extremely important role. We have already in that area around 140 projects funded by the European Commission. I think the dimension which we need to add is indeed, and we think about is first of all what was mentioned about social security schemes and how they're impacted, but also in terms of migration impact also in all the dimensions. I mean, I would say regular migration, of course, very important to see that this can be managed, and also, of course, for irregular migration if need be also. And I think this is it is very important to be able to also focus on these kind of things to raise the awareness also about the need to integrate this now in the future programming cycles also. And this is, I think, one of the key points, and I would say also my key takeaway from today also, that this is very important and that we need sometimes to get away from this very short-sighted crisis response, which have been done, to be honest, over the last years when we talk about Ukraine, Corona, financial crisis. It was always this kind of short-term thinking, and we need to be able, again, to go beyond that. Thank you.
So the short crises are diverting attention from the bigger issues, right? Rainer, one final thought from you?
The final word is resilience. Make sure that people can stay where they are as long as they want, and that they don't have to move out. Yeah, having to move is the ultimate exit. We should do everything before that happens. Now, it will not be the solution for some small laying island states, but it can be a solution for most parts of the world. We have to rethink a little bit this resilience issue because many of our initiatives are targeting rural populations. because that's, I mean, the focus of many of these development and climate change nexus projects. The population at risk that is growing fastest is urbanites, urban dwellers. So I think we need also strategies to have smarter cities, better preparedness in all these towns where the people are moving to. That's something that's a bit outside of the focus of part of the people engaging in the debate, because they always look at poor farmers that will lose their livelihoods and reduce crop yields and things like that. Freshwater stress, which is, I mean, all the case, but one should not forget about this urban side. So I think it's about resilience and it's about preparedness. And the preparedness becomes part of the resilience if, I mean, we have reached a certain level of preparedness. Still, you have to take decisions, budget allocation and otherwise, political decisions, under a high degree of uncertainty. And there you can say too much heroism is not helping. Unfortunately, politicians that get into the middle of a disaster and then show, I mean, this strength in having relieving people can become very popular. Whereas politicians who say we're going to prepare for all these things and then these things never happen during their tenure cannot gain popularity from that. And so I think this I mean, how you say, the question, how much attention do you want to pay to things, to imminent disasters that you want to immediately take care of, something like that, and how much you want to invest in more resilience and more preparedness is something that's often not easy, because the investment in more preparedness is often not that, I mean, the gain is not that visible. Yeah? And that's one of the problems from a political economy of, I mean, taking decisions and allocating budgets under high uncertainty. The question is, why would you invest in things that might never happen? And I think that's something that, I mean, needs to be solved. That's beyond my competence as a, you say, statistician and demographer, but I'm just, I came across this issue.
The issue of resilience is very popular here in Brussels, so I think we all understand that taking decisions under a huge sense of uncertainty is not an easy one. I'm afraid we are really over the time, so we have to stop here, but let me take this opportunity to thank you for coming, for producing the report and presenting it here in Brussels, and Rainer, thank you for making an excellent presentations and raising awareness of the numbers and how the numbers can help us understand the narrative, as Jane said, and how do you control that narrative. Again, thank you very much. Please join me in thanking the presenters, and we'll see you next time.